Space, the last great unknown. NASA's mission to unravel the mysteries of mankind's final frontier, to search for new knowledge and understanding,
Godspeed, John Glenn.
and to lead us towards a peaceful and unified future in space.
To the moon and the planets beyond.
The Eagle has landed.
This two-part film will explore 10 of NASA's greatest achievements in space and science and reveal how they are responsible for continually shaping the way we live our lives on Earth and how we view our place in the universe.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Human beings can turn their attention to the most improbable and the most audacious of endeavors.
It was the essential first step to get an American into space, and it worked.
The International Space Station truly is a wonder of space engineering.
The Hubble Space Telescope is a unique instrument.
Pathfinder did suggest that Mars may have had life early on in its history.
With the right amount of money, the right amount of skill, and the right amount of public support, we can do anything and go anywhere.
For the eyes of the world,
Absolutely incredible.
now look into space.
Okay, here we go.
To the moon and to the planets beyond.
Lift off.
And we set sail on this new sea to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all mankind.
Last time in part 1, we saw how Alan Shepard launched to become America's first astronaut.
Freedom 7 with astronaut Alan B. Shepard reports all systems go.
How NASA handled the triumphs and challenges of Ed White's Gemini spacewalk.
Beautiful job.
The legacy of the Pathfinder rover and its continued influence on the exploration of Mars. The planetary and deep space discoveries of the Voyager program. And how the Hubble Space Telescope has opened up the history book of our universe.
For the eyes of the world, now look into space.
Apollo 8 was NASA's first mission to attempt to fly humans to the moon and back, and arguably the boldest decision ever made in the history of human exploration. Facing serious speculation that the Soviet Union were preparing to send cosmonauts to the moon, NASA decided to reassign Apollo 8 to keep the US ahead of the Soviets in the space race. Instead of their planned Earth orbit mission, the three-man crew of Apollo 8 would now fly across the vast ocean of space, orbit the moon, and hopefully return safely to the Earth.
Apollo 8 was a very brave mission. They were going to go up to the moon and round the moon, which means for the first time, humans were going to go outside the area of influence of the Earth. You know, not on the Earth, not orbiting the Earth, they were going to go and orbit the moon.
Apollo 8 was the most audacious human spaceflight mission in history. This mission was going to go hundreds of times further in distance than what had been achieved until then in low Earth orbit.
Although they had tested out all of the hardware and the systems in Earth orbit, they had never left Earth orbit with humans. So it was a big risk.
It really was starting human exploration of deep space.
With its new circumlunar objective, not only could Apollo 8 keep the US ahead in the space race, but meet some significant technical milestones for NASA.
The importance of Apollo 8 for the program was that we needed to demonstrate that we could operate the Apollo spacecraft in an environment that no manned spacecraft had ever worked before, between Earth and Moon, where there was continuous sunlight 24 hours a day, and that the thermal control and that the communications at those great distances could operate in this completely new environment, and that the rocket motors could fire it into and out of lunar orbit. Essential for a landing.
As a mission of many firsts, the Apollo 8 crew would also be the first human beings to ride the mighty Saturn V rocket, the most powerful machine ever built by man.
It was the first time that a human crew had ridden a Saturn V rocket. NASA took this audacious risk of not only putting a human crew on board, but also sending them on a mission way beyond high Earth orbit, only a few thousand miles away. This mission was going to go 250,000 miles.
NASA's updated schedule left Apollo 8 astronauts Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders preparing for a new mission that would launch almost 3 months earlier than planned. But by December 1968, Apollo 8 was ready to make history.
This was a real leap in many, many ways. And with Borman, Lovell and Anders, they had a phenomenal team. They really captured the imagination.
We now have a report that the liquid hydrogen tank on the third stage is pressurized at this time as we come up on the 60-second mark on a flight to the moon. The vehicle now is completely pressurized. 45 seconds, final reports coming from Frank Borman aboard the spacecraft. T-minus 15, 14, 13, 12, 11, 10, 9. We have ignition sequence start. The engines are armed. 4, 3, 2, 1. We have liftoff.
Liftoff. The clock is running.
That's clear. Clock starts, right? Roger, clock. The tower is clear. Apollo 8, you're looking good.
Roger.
The weight of a warship lifting into the air.
It was just an enormous machine. It was a phenomenal thing to watch.
Apollo 8, Houston, your trajectory and guidance are go, over.
Thank you, Michael.
Yeah, you're looking real good, Mike. Apollo 8, Houston, you are go for staging, over.
Thank you, Houston. Apollo 8. Staging. The first stage was very smooth, and this one is smoother.
Apollo 8, you are go for TLI, over. We're go for TLI.
Here we were, leaving Earth and breaking that bond with our home planet to place men within the gravitational grip of another world in space. It was awesome.
During Apollo 8's flight to the moon, astronauts Borman, Lovell and Anders became the first humans to venture beyond low Earth orbit. After 3 days and flying 380,000 kilometers, Apollo 8 arrived at the moon and entered lunar orbit.
This is Apollo Control, Houston. There's a cheer in this room. We've got it. We've got it. Apollo 8 now in lunar orbit.
Apollo 8, Houston, what does the old moon look like from 60 miles, over?
The moon is essentially gray. No color. We can see quite a bit of detail. The craters are all rounded off. There's quite a few of them.
Roger, understand.
One of Apollo 8's main objectives was the reconnaissance of NASA's planned landing sites. And over the next 20 hours, the crew collected 700 photographs of the lunar surface in never-before-seen detail. On their 9th orbit of the moon, the crew sent a Christmas Eve message back to Earth, which was watched by the largest global television audience in history.
For all the people back on Earth, the crew of Apollo 8 has a message that we would like to send to you. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light.
This really was magic. Those words have a raw power. Genesis, as a passage from the Old Testament, is at the core of 3 of the world's great religions. And so this resonated not just with people in the United States, but with a global audience.
This was no longer a nation fulfilling its national aspirations, but it was a world collectively represented by 3 humans traveling in orbit around another world and invoking a spiritual sense of identity that rose above the petty bickering. It made people realize there was something bigger, grander, and even more meaningful to the human spirit.
And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth.
However, the most famous image captured by Apollo 8 was not of the moon, but of the Earth. Known as Earthrise, this photograph was taken by astronaut Bill Anders and is believed to be the most reproduced image in human history.
The power of that image gave humans on Earth a perspective of just how unique in our solar system our planet is. All of life that we know thus far has emerged on that pale blue dot, that sphere that's there. And to imagine that 3 human beings can look back at where they came from and cover it up with their thumbs, it still makes the hair on the back of my neck stand on end thinking about it.
And these things, I think, are tremendously important to give everybody a view of our place in space, because that's our world. Look how thin the atmosphere is, look how fragile it looks, look at all this space around, and it's tiny. Look after it.
The pictures of Earth from space mobilized an environmental movement in the United States, that we have an Earth that's very fragile. If we continue to rampage through its resources, consuming them at a prodigious and profligate rate, that we will soon have a dry and dusty bowl such as that we see in the world we went to visit, the moon, and saw an Earth that was so different, so beautiful, so full of life, but so fragile.
Apollo 8's successful first flight to the moon paved the way for the lunar landings that followed and allowed NASA to meet President Kennedy's goal of placing a man on the moon by the end of the 1960s. But perhaps Apollo 8's greatest legacy was that in our quest to study the moon, humanity truly discovered the Earth. And only by leaving our planet behind could we look back and see for the first time our whole world. NASA's space shuttle represented the first vehicle in a new breed of spacecraft, based off a radically new approach to space travel. The plan to replace the costly method of launching manned capsules on expendable rocket boosters with a reusable spacecraft. Not only would such a vehicle reduce the cost of space exploration, increasing America's access to Earth orbit, but it could also support NASA's ambitious future of permanently manned space stations.
The shuttle was conceived as a reusable launch vehicle when it was obvious that throwing these rockets away after only one use was going to be unsustainable if the flight rates went up and up and up. It would bankrupt the space program.
The cost of getting to space has always been very expensive, and the idea was to build something that you could bring back, whether it was with cargo or whether it was astronauts. And that ought to reduce the price to orbit per kilogram by a factor of 10.
Long before the first landing on the moon, people were looking to the future and realizing that if we had space stations, we'd need to routinely go back and forth on a regular basis. And so we needed some kind of vehicle that was reusable. And then people became aware that, well, if you've got a vehicle that can do that, it can maybe launch small satellites. And then when it became apparent that maybe we wanted to build a space station incrementally through separate modules assembled on a pay-as-you-go basis, rather than one giant space station launched on a super booster, you could do that with shuttle.
The design of the space shuttle resembled that of a conventional aircraft, with 2 wings and a tail. In this configuration, the shuttle was more like a space plane that could glide back to Earth, land on a runway, and be readied for its next mission. A unique feature of the shuttle design was its large cargo bay that would allow the vehicle to ferry a wide variety of scientific payloads into orbit. This would enable NASA to easily deploy satellites and, for the first time, capture and return payloads back to Earth.
The shuttle was really meant to be a multifaceted tool. It was a logical thing to do, a logical step. In particular, you're looking for a tool that you could use to mend spacecraft, a tool that you could use to service an international space station, for example, or any space station. You could launch things from it. Myself personally, I was involved with a thing called the Solar Maximum mission, which was the first in-orbit repair of a spacecraft. You couldn't have done that any other way, sensibly. You had a machine that could get up there, literally grab the spacecraft, pull it into the cargo bay, people could work on it, and you could relaunch it. And it's done all of those things over the years and done them brilliantly.
After nearly a decade of development and testing, NASA's space shuttle fleet finally went into service in April 1981 and launched a new era of manned exploration.
Firing chain is armed. Go for main engine start.
OTCTLT, APU pre-start complete. 3 great talkbacks. Thank you, Charlie.
STD, CCLS, 1212, we're ready to go. Copy that. On my mark. 3, 2, 1, mark.
Two, 1, 0, and lift off. The shoulders of the space shuttle, America will continue the dream.
The space shuttle spreads its wings for this journey into history.
Roll program.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
Roll program complete. 4.5 million pounds of hardware and humans. Heads down, wings level on the proper alignment for its 8.5-minute ride to orbit.
Go with throttle up.
Roger, go throttle up.
The space shuttle's traveling almost 2,600 miles an hour, 21 miles in altitude, 24 miles downrange. Standing by for solid rocket booster separation. A good solid rocket booster separation. The main engine steering the shuttle on a pinpoint path to its preliminary orbit.
Between 1981 and 2011, NASA's fleet of 5 space shuttles flew a total of 135 missions. During their 30 years of service, the shuttles carried more than 350 astronauts to and from orbit and allowed mankind to push the boundaries of humanity's space exploration. The shuttles launched and repaired hundreds of satellites, acted as orbital space laboratories, and assisted in the construction of the International Space Station, the largest and most complex object ever assembled in space.
The shuttle's main objective was, of course, as a routine ferry back and forth between the surface of the Earth and near space. But clearly no other vehicle at the time on the drawing board or conceived could possibly have assembled the 400-ton International Space Station that has been permanently manned since the year 2000 and may very well have at least 3 decades of life for scientists from all over the world.
Despite NASA's supreme efforts, the shuttle program did not make space travel as frequent or affordable as predicted. Originally billed as a vehicle that would launch twice a month, in reality, shuttle missions averaged at 4 a year. And the operational costs of the program were higher than anticipated, due to the extensive maintenance required to keep a reusable spacecraft in service. The safety of the vehicle was also questioned, following the tragic accidents that led to the loss of Space Shuttles Challenger and Columbia and their respective crews. But inquiries into both incidents revealed that management problems at NASA were to blame, rather than flight engineer complacency or the reliability of the shuttle hardware, concluding that tragically, both disasters could have been avoided. Sometimes the failings of the shuttle are made to overshadow its achievements. But make no mistake, this experimental spaceplane has set a staggering benchmark for the future of reusable spacecraft.
Reusable space launch vehicles are essential for the future if we're going to cut the cost of space travel and space transportation. They're very costly to develop, very difficult to produce, but they are the only way to get low-cost transportation back and forth between Earth and space. They are inevitable.
I think the lasting legacy for shuttle is that it is possible to both bring the vehicle back and astronauts back in the same vehicle that they went up on, and that there is at least now the practical possibility of reducing cost to orbit, but there's still a long way to go yet.
We cannot continue to use rockets that we throw away after each launch. The ordinary jobs and the routine access for humans and for medium to small cargoes has to go on reusable launch vehicles. There's no other way.
What started as a truly space-age concept evolved into an iconic vehicle like no other machine ever built. The Space Shuttle was a gateway to Earth orbit that for millions around the world came to symbolize the adventure and spirit of exploration.
The first launch that I ever saw live on TV was a Space Shuttle launch. I found that inspiring. As a small child, you see a plane being launched into space. And certainly that was inspirational from my perspective.
You have to sort of stand to one side and not ignore the fact that a huge amount has been achieved by this general purpose tool that has allowed us to do a huge amount that a lot of us have benefited from in terms of the machinery we can get up there, machinery we can maintain. Even if it's from people understanding the universe, because I can see the images from Hubble that was launched with the shuttle and managed through shuttle missions. Just bringing people together that can only be good for mankind. The shuttle played a huge part in that, and we should never forget it.
Finally retired in 2011, NASA's Space Shuttle fleet not only paved the way for the vital next step in manned spaceflight, but has enabled the technological world we now enjoy, and should be forever heralded as one of NASA's greatest achievements.
The end of a historic journey, and to the ship that has led the way time and time again, we say farewell, Discovery.
The International Space Station is a habitable space laboratory parked in low Earth orbit and the greatest international collaboration in the history of human space exploration. Home to a multinational crew of 6 astronauts who live and work in space, the ISS was built to advance our long-duration spaceflight capability. But despite being the blueprint for global space cooperation, the International Space Station has its origins deep in the Cold War.
Back in the 1980s, relations between the Soviet Union and the United States were still pretty much in a deep freeze. Now, NASA had plans for its own space station, Freedom, but the budgets were ballooning. And NASA realized that its aspirations for having a long-duration capability for spaceflight were going to be pretty much on the shelf for as long as the shuttle program was going on. At the same time, the Soviet Union had spectacularly built up human spaceflight experience through the series of Salyut space stations culminating in the Mir program. NASA had done nothing like this since Skylab in the early 1970s.
Although the Skylab program had been a resounding success for NASA, the agency was in desperate need of space station freedom to advance its orbital operations. But when the Soviet Union collapsed at the beginning of the 1990s, it gave NASA a golden opportunity to support and collaborate with the new Russian space agency. And in 1993, plans for space station freedom were merged with Russia's proposed Mir 2 project to form the first international space station program. A global partnership of 15 nations worked together, despite differences in language, politics and manufacturing styles, to plan and complete the greatest engineering project in history.
The International Space Station truly is a wonder of space engineering when it comes down to human spaceflight. And the first components were launched in 1998. It's taken the combined resources of more than 15 nations and 40 missions to assemble this structure in Earth orbit that's larger than a football field. It's got a mass of nearly 500 tons.
You should think of the space station as a gigantic Lego set where bits and pieces are launched into space and then bolted together actually in orbit. It's far too big to be launched from the ground, and we actually don't have a launch vehicle that's physically capable of taking that whole structure into space on its own. So you have to launch it in pieces and assemble it in orbit.
The modular design of the International Space Station has allowed different bays and components to be engineered and manufactured by 5 different space agencies around the world. This unprecedented technological and political partnership sees Russian, Japanese, European and Canadian space agencies working alongside NASA to operate and service the ISS.
The international nature of the space station is probably the greatest success as a program rather than an individual mission or event that NASA has ever achieved, to bring together the nations of the world to what is now the full International Space Station, populated with former Cold War adversaries coming together to do science.
Since the arrival of the first crew in November 2000, the station has been constantly occupied by astronauts and cosmonauts from 15 different nations, representing the longest continuous human presence in space. The International Space Station is a unique scientific platform where research into biology, physics and astronomy converges with technological developments and innovation. In this orbiting laboratory, crew members conduct advanced experiments that would not be possible on Earth, with the unified goal of sharing breakthroughs and knowledge for the betterment of humanity.
The ISS truly is humanity's orbital space science outpost. The research that's being done on board is giving us new insights into so many different areas, from materials science to fundamental physics, because some of the insights gained from instruments on the station are giving us new ideas about the structure and possible future fate of the universe.
Vaccine development, orbital images assisting disaster relief, and educational programs inspiring future scientists, engineers and astronauts are just some of the medical, economic and environmental benefits the ISS is contributing to human life on Earth. In 2005, the station's sophisticated facilities were opened up to institutes and scientists on Earth. And now people all over the world are using this space research for Earth-based applications. But with all eyes on mankind's next giant leap in space exploration, the station is also paving the way for future missions to the Moon, Mars, and beyond.
A manned mission to Mars is going to be a very difficult thing to do. Although we have the basic technology, It's going to take at least 7 or 8 months to send people to Mars. Then they have to stay there for about a year before they can come back, which is another 7 or 8 months. So we're really talking about a round trip that lasts more than 2 years. The difficult logistic point is to work out how to survive for that length of time. Not just from a physical point of view, but actually if you're going on a long journey, you might have to learn how to grow food. And one of the things that the space station is a good platform for is learning how to grow things in low gravity conditions.
What we have learned is how multiple agencies from different parts of the world can collaborate even when there are political differences. And if we are to go to Mars, in my mind, it's almost guaranteed to be an international mission. So for me, ISS has been the challenges of human spaceflight engineering, building those huge structures and maintaining them when the politics on the ground might not be so rosy.
The International Space Station is the largest and most complex object ever assembled in space. A project which, after a decade of success, has proven its worth as an off-world science lab and pioneered techniques for building and maintaining equipment in orbit. But perhaps the station's greatest accomplishment is its blueprint. A blueprint that gives our world a chance to achieve goals together that single nations alone could not accomplish.
The legacy of what was achieved in the International Space Station is that despite political difficulties, despite uncertainties between partners of the International Space Station, that continues to be a committed preserve where we all get on with each other and work for the common scientific interests.
The ISS program from the start was politically driven, but what's emerged from it has been a fantastic tribute to cooperation between so many space agencies around the world.
You cannot now put the genie back in the bottle. A precedent has been set. This is the way forward, and it's a great way for settling political difficulties. Sleeves rolled up, working together.
Just 2 decades since the end of the Cold War, the International Space Station embodies what global cooperation can achieve. The ISS is humanity's first firm foothold for life in space. Our springboard for visiting destinations beyond Earth orbit. And another giant leap in mankind's quest to explore the final frontier. The Apollo lunar space program is cemented in time for the scale of its ambition and accomplishments. But one of the greatest moments in NASA's history was so nearly its worst. In April 1970, the Apollo program was in full swing. The last 16 months had seen 12 men fly to the moon and 4 walk upon its surface. And astronauts Fred Hayes and Jack Swigert were training alongside Apollo 13 commander and veteran astronaut Jim Lovell for NASA's most ambitious mission yet.
Apollo 13 really went to take a step further than the previous 2 Apollos that had been on the moon. They had landed in areas called mare, these sort of flat plains, so you only looked at the rocks that were right on the surface. And there's a lot of interest in what's happening down below the surface of those mare. So Apollo 13's aim was to go to an impact crater where some huge collision had happened with an asteroid. That impact had thrown material out, and it dug it up from lower regions of the crust. And Apollo 13 was targeted to try and get to rocks that were characteristic of a different age of the moon compared to Apollo 12.
Apollo 13 launched to explore the moon and follow in the successful lunar footprints of Apollos 11 and 12. But just 56 hours into the mission, the spacecraft suffered a devastating malfunction.
Apollo 13, Houston, we'd like it to stir up your cryo tanks.
Okay, stand by.
about 56 hours, all three of us heard a rather large bang, just one bang.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem.
Stand by, they got a problem. We got more than a problem.
Okay, listen, you guys. Fuel cells 1 and 3 are offline.
All right, that's what we're reading.
When an onboard oxygen tank ruptured, 2 of the spacecraft's 3 fuel cells began bleeding precious power.
We gotta get a pressure readout on that thing.
O2 quantity number 2 is 0.
That's the end right there.
I can't believe that.
The mood in mission control was immediately one of disbelief.
I have absolutely no clue to what happened. Something happened to the fuel cells in the oxygen tank.
And when I looked up and saw both oxygen pressures, one absolutely 0 and the other one going down, it dawned on me, and I'm sure Jack and Fred about the same time, that we were indeed in serious trouble.
And it looks to me that we are venting something out into space. It's a gas of some sort.
Roger, we copy your venting.
Not only is oxygen vital to keep the crew alive, but the spacecraft's 3 fuel cells could not generate power without it.
It was quite apparent to me that it was just a question of time that the command module was going to be dead.
We're still 70 to 80 hours away from the Earth.
Without power, the spacecraft would shut down, communication systems would die, and the crew would be stranded in space.
Within 2 hours, the 3rd fuel cell had to be shut down. That's the only means of electrical power for everything needed to get the crew back to Earth alive.
200,000 miles from Earth and trapped in a dying spacecraft, the crew of Apollo 13 faced a life and death crisis. NASA had just one chance to bring their men safely home.
We knew that the command module was going to lose power. The only way to survive the situation was to transfer to the lunar module, and we started going through procedures to get power on.
The initial reaction was stabilization, to get the whole mission stable so that we could at least buy a bit of time. Assign people to study how we keep the crew alive and how we keep our options open.
With its own independent life support, power and communication systems, the lunar module could act as a lifeboat. But with only a 45-hour lifespan intended for a 2-man crew, NASA ground teams had to work around the clock to keep 3 men alive for the 90-hour flight back to Earth.
The main difficulty that the astronauts had is they were losing power all the time, and they had to find a way of maintaining power for the whole duration of the flight.
To support 3 men for 3.5 days, the whole way in which it was operated had to change.
To combat the astronauts' dwindling consumables, NASA instructed the crew to power down the lunar module, preserving the spacecraft's limited water and electricity supply. However, the crew suffered serious dehydration, and the temperature inside the lunar module plummeted.
It was sort of a chilling coldness. The walls were perspiring, the windows were completely wet, and it wasn't too healthy. I recall that it was like reaching into the freezer for the food.
There was ice forming on the inside of the windows. The crew were beginning to suffer under those appalling conditions. It was a dire state. It was a real emergency situation.
The survival of the crew was further jeopardized by the looming problem of carbon dioxide buildup on board the spacecraft.
When you breathe oxygen, you exhale carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide, if you don't do anything about it, builds up in the sealed environment of the space capsule and becomes a poison.
Lithium hydroxide canisters were used to scrub the air supply of carbon dioxide. But with the commander module powered down, the lunar module's scrubbing system was being overworked, only designed to support 2 men for 2 days, not 3 men for 4 days.
It wasn't possible to take the lithium hydroxide crystals from the command module and place them in the lunar module because the shapes were different.
The command module canisters were square cross-section, and believe it or not, the ones in the LEM were round cross-section. This was a very serious problem. I mean, it could easily have been the end of the rescue mission had they not solved it.
NASA had just hours to engineer a system that patched the square canisters into the lunar module life support system, using only what the astronauts had available to them.
So we're talking about duct tape, plastic bags, pairs of scissors. And what had to happen in mission control is a complete set of flight instructions had to be devised for the crew so that operating in almost 0 centigrade conditions in a spacecraft deprived of virtually all of its electrical power, the crew had to build this material knowing that if they didn't get it right, they were going to be dead before their return to Earth.
The ground read us up a procedure in order to adapt some of the canisters, and as they read this thing up, Jim and I constructed one of these things.
Cut a piece of tape this long, put it up there, do this, do that. It worked a treat, you know. Within an hour of switching it on, the carbon dioxide levels were way down, and they were through that really serious consumable problem.
There were moments when I didn't know how much consumables we had, whether we could make it back or not, but in a situation like that, there's only one thing you can do. You just keep going, and you just keep thinking up where you can get more consumables. And so that's exactly what we did.
It is without question that one of NASA's greatest triumphs during the Apollo 13 rescue was the way Mission Control successfully stretched out the dwindling life support consumables. Had these consumables not been monitored and economized as accurately, the mission and the crew would have been lost.
In the entire history of human spaceflight dating back to 1961, Apollo 13 was the most dangerous episode in which the crew has successfully survived.
And there's one whole side of that street there missing. The whole panel is blown out from the base to the engine. Copy that.
What happened in Mission Control and by the crew themselves showed that the NASA spirit at the time was absolutely up to the challenge, not only of getting human beings to the moon, but returning them to Earth safely when you've got multiple emergencies coming up that are threatening your crew's survival again and again and again.
Extremely loud applause as Apollo 13 comes through loud and clear on the television display here.
I regard Apollo 13 as an immensely impressive example of engineering. The systems engineering, the organizational engineering was so solid, was so intelligent, was so well structured that when the accident happened, the organization was found totally capable of dealing with it. And I can't imagine why anybody would want to be anything other than an engineer.
Failure is not an option. And it was that idea that we could prevail. It was the finest example of that spirit that's not only in NASA, it's within people, this is humans that did this. In this situation, and all similar situations, it's really about people and about what they give beyond what they're asked for.
One of the most important points that can be made of this flight is the initiative that people have when suddenly faced with an unusual situation. I think it's amazing the way that people can respond so fast to get this job done.
The safe return of the Apollo 13 crew is a testament to the caliber and dedication of the engineers and astronauts of the Apollo lunar program, and is universally regarded as NASA's finest hour.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish.
On the 25th of May, 1961, President John F. Kennedy challenged the United States to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
NASA had just 8 years to pioneer the technology to shoot men into deep space and return them safely to the Earth. But in 1961, a rocket powerful enough to reach the moon did not yet exist. A landing vehicle capable of touching down on the lunar surface had not yet been designed. Spacesuit technology was in its infancy, and it was not even known whether humans could survive in the vacuum of space. In 1961, walking on the moon was science fiction, but by 1970, it had to be science fact. What followed was one of the most intense and unified national efforts the world has ever known, and the greatest engineering challenge in the history of mankind. In July 1969, Apollo 11 made history as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin became the first of 12 astronauts to walk on the moon.
Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
We copy you down, Eagle. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
I'm at the foot of the ladder. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The 6 Apollo lunar landing missions demonstrated the most audacious attempt to challenge humans on the technological frontiers of the 20th century that could ever have been put before a single group of people. Human beings can turn their attention to the most improbable and the most audacious of endeavors.
It felt like we were at the beginning of a human adventure, which made it terribly exciting.
For a magical moment, humanity was united as one. People were saying, "You did it for us." It wasn't seen that the United States had set foot on the moon. It was the human race. And so for me, that's the magic of Apollo 11 and all of those subsequent missions.
After the triumph of Apollo 11, NASA landed 5 more exploration missions on the surface of the moon, each more advanced and ambitious than the last.
Of the 6 Apollo lunar landing missions, the last 3 were incredibly productive scientifically because they built on the previous flights in a very big way. They had a lunar module that could stay 3 full working days on the surface, that had a lunar roving vehicle that could carry the crew miles to different sites of geological and scientific interest. It carried a much larger suite of experiments to operate for nearly 10 years after the crew returned, sending information back to scientists all over the world. That prodigious outpouring of data was really one of the greatest achievements of the whole Apollo program and transformed it from a political objective in getting to the surface ahead of the Russians into a very, very major scientific endeavor.
This unprecedented scientific yield has unlocked the history and evolution of our planet and the solar system. But the benefits of NASA's Apollo program are far more wide-reaching for us all.
Sending human beings to the moon laid the groundwork for exploration of the rest of our solar system. So sending robotic explorers off to Mars, Venus, but they also laid the way for international collaboration. Sending people up to the International Space Station, working together for a common cause would not have been possible without the technology developed through the Apollo missions. Hopefully, although it's NASA's greatest achievement to date, there's going to be plenty more equally exciting achievements down the line for exploring the solar system.
Between 1968 and 1972, 24 men flew to the moon and 12 walked upon its surface for the benefit of all mankind. The flags and footprints left behind during the Apollo lunar program have come to symbolize not only NASA's greatest achievement, but the achievement of an entire generation and the promise of mankind's future in space.
It's the world taking the next steps. It's not just NASA, and NASA's been fantastic and led the way, but all these voyages in space, we're all doing this together.
With the right amount of money, the right amount of skill, and the right amount of political and public support, we can do anything and go anywhere. And I think if we want to go to Mars, we can do that.
This renewed human commitment to deep space exploration that we're seeing, it's going to remind us of what exploration is all about. And once again, of what being humans is all about.
The space program is really responsible for telling us who we are. It's shown us our place in the universe and really marks the beginning of the environmental movement.
We didn't have respect for this planet until we could look back at it and see how unique it actually is. And if we don't look after it, our children's children will not be here to appreciate it in the way we can today.
Whatever the future may hold for space exploration, it's clear that what NASA has achieved in just a few decades has defined how we live on our home planet and how we will explore our future in space.
I personally like to think the greatest achievement of NASA is that it is a civilian-based agency, actually international in its aspirations to draw in a world community of scientists and researchers, and to inspire the next generation of students, scientists and engineers to literally go where no one else has gone before and be the representational catalyst for all spacefaring nations to follow it to the exploration of the solar system and beyond.
Space, the last great unknown. NASA's mission: to unravel the mysteries of mankind's final frontier, to search for new knowledge and understanding,
Godspeed, John Glenn.
and to lead us towards a peaceful and unified future in space.
To the moon and the planets beyond.
The Eagle has landed.
This two-part film will explore 10 of NASA's greatest achievements in space and science and reveal how they are responsible for continually shaping the way we live our lives on Earth and how we view our place in the universe.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Human beings can turn their attention to the most improbable and the most audacious of endeavors.
It was the essential first step to get an American into space, and it worked.
The International Space Station truly is a wonder of space engineering.
The Hubble Space Telescope is a unique instrument.
Pathfinder did suggest that Mars may have had life early on in its history.
With the right amount of money, the right amount of skill, and the right amount of public support, we can do anything and go anywhere.
For the eyes of the world,
Absolutely incredible.
now look into space,
Okay, here we go.
to the moon and to the planets beyond.
Lift off.
And we set sail on this new sea to solve these mysteries, to solve them for the good of all mankind.
When the Soviets launched the Sputnik satellite in 1957, great concern was expressed by the US government about the technological superiority of their Cold War enemy. It was clear that a federal organization for spearheading American space efforts was needed, and in 1958, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, known as NASA, was born. But despite its Cold War genesis, NASA formed as a distinctly civilian agency, with a focus on the peaceful exploration of space and science.
President Eisenhower wanted a space program for science and technology that was not based on the military occupation of space. And his emblem was Space for Peace. He was deeply concerned that if left to their own devices, the military would occupy space and take the high ground. Had that occurred, you would never have seen any of the great accomplishments in science or engineering that embraced the world. And enshrined in NASA's mandate is international cooperation and the free sharing of scientific data. Impossible if the military were running the space program.
Thanks to Eisenhower's forward-thinking administration, NASA has been the world's leading manned and unmanned space research agency since the late 1950s, setting the precedent for all present and future spacefaring nations.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we are introducing to you and to the world these 7 men who have been selected to begin training for orbital space flight. These, ladies and gentlemen, are the nation's Mercury astronauts.
On April 9th, 1959, NASA introduced to the world the astronauts selected to pilot Project Mercury, America's first manned space program. Known as the Mercury 7, these men immediately became national heroes, ready to race the Soviet Union to space. Project Mercury's first goal was to put a solo human into Earth orbit, and the first mission assigned to attempt this goal was named Freedom 7.
Freedom 7 was America's first foray into human spaceflight. And it came at a rather difficult period in time because 3 weeks before the launch of Freedom 7, Russia had successfully launched Yuri Gagarin, who became the first human in space. The US was already lagging behind in the space race, giving it a rather negative image internationally, so it really needed a good news story, and Freedom 7 gave it that story.
Of the Mercury 7, astronaut Alan Shepard was chosen to become the first American to fly in space. He was to pilot the Mercury Redstone launch vehicle, a hybrid of a US Army ballistic missile and a research and development rocket, modified for human flight. Finally, on May 5th, 1961, Al Shepard left Cape Canaveral and led the United States into a new era of manned space exploration.
Flight, this is M&O. Go ahead, M&O. All subsystems status green. Roger, M&O. Understand all systems green.
It's 60 seconds and counting.
T-minus
1 minute and counting.
Status check, pressurization. Locks tanking. You are go. Order systems, go.
T-minus 30 seconds.
Mercury capsule, go. All pre-start panel lights are correct. The ready light is on.
T-minus 15 seconds.
Eject Mercury umbilical. Mercury umbilical clear. Mercury is go. Lights on.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
Engine start.
Ignition.
All right, liftoff and the clock has started. This is Freedom 7, reading you loud and clear. The fuel is go, 1.2 G. Cabin at 14 PSI. Oxygen is go. All systems are go.
Freedom 7 with astronaut Alan B. Shepard reports the fuel system is go, oxygen go, all systems go. Astronaut Alan B. Shepard is working like a test pilot, reporting facts and figures, reporting procedures in the precise engineering manner of a test pilot. Trajectory looks A-OK. What a beautiful view.
Freedom 7's suborbital flight lasted 15 minutes and followed a parabolic trajectory, arcing over the Earth's surface to land in the ocean 302 miles downrange. The main scientific objective of Project Mercury was to determine man's capability in the space environment and the conditions under which astronauts would have to work.
In contrast to Yuri Gagarin's flight, which was effectively an automated flight, Gagarin had the ability to control the spacecraft, but didn't. Shepard's flight allowed him to exercise some control over the spacecraft.
Pilot reports assuming retro attitude, initiating retro fire sequence. Pilot reports mission very smooth.
During the early phase of the mission, he was able to take control of the spacecraft. He was able to fire the attitude control thrusters to control the orientation of the spacecraft.
He's going to hand control movements now, switching to manual control of the pitch attitude.
So Shepard genuinely took real control of the spacecraft. He wasn't just there for the ride. He wasn't simply baggage.
After re-entry, the capsule of Freedom 7 landed by parachute in the Atlantic Ocean, with Al Shepard paving the way for every NASA astronaut and manned mission to come.
The US were desperate to get into space. With Al Shepard, it was a suborbital flight, but it took an awful lot of courage from him, for the other people involved, and was clearly, when it's right at the beginning like that, it seems so basic now to be sitting on top of what is an intercontinental ballistic missile, basically, and like the blue touch paper run and collect him at the other end. But it was the essential first step to get an American into space, and it worked, and it was a phenomenal achievement for him and the team.
The initial Mercury manned spaceflight certainly helped lift the spirits in America of people who felt that the Russians were racing ahead, that they'd been eclipsed with Sputnik, they'd been eclipsed with Yuri Gagarin. In the first months of a president who had criticized the government it replaced for sitting on their hands while the Russians romped away into the future. So it was vital to restore American pride and to mobilize a can-do spirit, so that weeks later, when Kennedy announced the decision to go to the moon, people could believe it.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Freedom 7 was a vital component of Kennedy's moon program that had been decided before Alan Shepard first went into orbit. And in fact, the announcement of that decision was held back until Alan Shepard's flight on the 5th of May 1961. Freedom 7 had to happen for Kennedy's commitment to go to the moon to be publicly announced and to be a funded program. Otherwise, we would probably not have been on the moon even yet.
Freedom 7 was only the beginning of Al Shepard's spaceflight career. He later served as chief of the astronaut office. And then, in 1971, flew to the moon as commander of Apollo 14.
Okay, Al, we can see you coming down the ladder right now. Bedford, old man. And it's been a long way, but we're here.
Human spaceflight has changed dramatically since 1961. Today's flights are complex, multi-crew, multinational missions working together in the spirit of international collaboration. But the legacy of Freedom 7, Al Shepard, and the pioneering Mercury project will be remembered every time NASA launches humans into space.
Godspeed, John Glenn.
Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway. Oh, that view is tremendous. Beautiful.
After President Kennedy announced plans for landing Americans on the moon by the end of the 1960s, it became immediately obvious to NASA that a follow-on program to Project Mercury was required to develop the techniques needed to support these future missions to the moon. NASA announced the second manned human spaceflight program, known as Project Gemini, in January 1962. Gemini would act as the bridge between the Mercury and Apollo programs, with the key objectives of demonstrating the endurance of astronauts and spacecraft for the extended duration spaceflight required to fly to the moon and back.
Flights to the moon would take over a week to complete, and so one of Gemini's main aims was to establish the ability of humans to withstand long-duration spaceflight, to understand the physiological effects of spending that much time in a zero-gravity environment.
Project Gemini would also develop techniques for rendezvousing and docking spacecraft in orbit, refine atmospheric re-entry and splashdown procedures so that specific landing sites were reached, and perfect the art of spacewalking. If an astronaut is to walk on the surface of the moon, they must first leave the safety of the spacecraft. Gemini astronauts were the first to train for these specialist spacewalks.
Gemini was one of the pathways to the moon. And the whole point of getting outside the capsule and performing a spacewalk is that it was known that that would be necessary. Learning to operate outside the spacecraft was an essential component of getting to the moon. It's an essential component of what we do now with the space station. It always will be.
EVA stands for extravehicular activity, which means the astronaut is working outside of the confines of the spacecraft, essentially in free space. It was critical as a part of the preparations for the lunar landing, because one of the main objectives of the lunar landing is to work outside of the spacecraft, to leave the lunar module and work in the lunar surface environment. It's also very important to be able to leave the spacecraft in the event that any repairs were required. So the ability of an astronaut to leave the confines of the cabin and to retrieve material or to fix problems on the outside of the spacecraft, while clearly it was hoped that that would never be necessary, it was important to show that that was possible.
The first NASA mission to attempt an EVA was Gemini 4, the second manned mission of the Gemini program. Gemini 4, flown by astronauts Jim McDivitt and Ed White, was assigned the task of proving that the US were gaining on the early progress of the Soviets. Using Project Gemini's new launch vehicle, the Gemini Titan II rocket, McDivitt and White left Cape Canaveral on June 3, 1965.
6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Liftoff. We have a liftoff at 16 minutes after the hour. Climbing very nicely. We have a roll program initiated. We have staging, and it's been confirmed here on the ground.
Thrust looks good.
Thrust looks good on the second stage. And McDivitt, in a very, very calm voice, said it looks great up here.
After their third orbit of the Earth, Ed White opened the hatch of the Gemini capsule and made history, becoming the first American to walk in space.
Okay, I'm separating from the spacecraft. My feet are out. Okay, I'm out.
Tethered to the spacecraft, Ed White floated free 200 miles above the Earth, traveling at 17,000 miles per hour.
Okay, I'm coming over. You see me yet? I feel like $1 million. This is the greatest experience, and it's just tremendous.
The footage of Ed White's EVA is one of the most recognizable and iconic set of images from the early period of the space program. Up until that point, the astronauts had been seeing everything either through periscopes in the early days of the Mercury program or from quite small cabin windows. And here was an astronaut opening the door in orbit and moving out into free space where his view of the Earth and the spacecraft was completely unobstructed. All he had was a large visor through which he could get the full vista.
It was such an inspirational thing. Phenomenal achievement. And to be honest, a brave one. If you imagine you open the door of the spacecraft and you get out, that was a fantastic thing to do.
Ed White's EVA was proof that the United States was catching up with the early Soviet successes, and that NASA training and hardware was capable of winning the space race to the moon. However, NASA's first spacewalk didn't go completely to plan. A communications problem meant that Mission Control could not establish radio contact with Gemini 4 for the majority of the EVA.
Gemini 4, Houston, Capcom. Gemini 4, Houston, Capcom.
Ground control were very concerned because the astronauts were losing track of time. The people on the ground were frantically trying to get a signal to the astronauts to terminate the spacewalk.
Flight controllers were concerned that if Gemini 4 didn't keep to the mission timeline, astronaut White could find himself walking in space on the night side of the Earth. In total darkness, it would be extremely difficult for him to maneuver back to the safety of the capsule.
Jimmy 4, Houston, Capcom. Jimmy 4, Houston, Capcom.
Finally, Jim McDivitt noticed and fixed an incorrect switch configuration in the capsule that reopened communication channels with Mission Control.
And as he did that, Jim McDivitt said, we better find out what Capcom think.
See what flight director's got to say.
Capcom got the signal, and the immediate response was,
The flight director says get back in.
Well, this is Jim. Got any message for us?
Jimmy 4, get back in.
Okay.
So in the audio coming from Capcom, it's essentially Mission Control telling the astronauts to stop playing about and get back into the capsule.
Roger, we've been trying to talk to you for a while here.
No, back in. Come on. I'm coming. Okay.
Ed White's EVA lasted just 23 minutes. But NASA learned a very important lesson about how humans operate in the vacuum of space.
NASA discovered that EVA is difficult. Working in that spacesuit, which is very constraining, is really exhausting. And the subsequent Gemini EVAs all led to the astronauts returning to the capsule in a really overheated, exhausted state.
It wasn't until 8 Gemini missions later that astronaut Buzz Aldrin, who would later walk on the moon alongside Neil Armstrong, conducted the first fully extensive EVA.
Gemini 12, Houston, Capcom, 1 minute to EVA record. Beautiful job.
His success was attributed in large to his experience as a scuba diver. Aldrin pioneered the technique of underwater neutral buoyancy training, which simulates an environment similar to working conditions found in space. Project Gemini flew 10 manned missions between 1965 and 1966, firmly putting the United States ahead of the Soviets in the Cold War space race. And the neutral buoyancy training developed during Gemini remains an integral part of the astronaut training regime to this day, responsible for the success of every NASA EVA to date. NASA's first close-up observations of the planet Mars were conducted by the Mariner and Viking programs during the 1960s and 70s. These historic missions gave us our first views of the mysterious red planet, both from orbit and down on the surface.
The exploration of Mars could be considered one of NASA's greatest achievements. The early period of its exploration from 1965 to the late 1970s saw NASA achieve the first landing on the surface of Mars of 2 laboratories that extensively analyzed, trenched, and photographed the surface at 2 separate sites.
After the early pioneering missions of the 60s and 70s, there was a hiatus in the American exploration of Mars. Only in the early 1990s did NASA begin developing a new program of landers and rovers that could work across the Martian surface to visit multiple sites.
We'd seen with Apollo how the lunar roving vehicle had been able to move around various areas of geologic interest around a common site. We wanted to do that with Mars. Get it mobile, not just have a lander that sat there, but could move on. And, you know, it's entirely coincidental with the human spirit. You climb one hill, you see another and want to climb that. And that's what these rovers are capable of doing.
After almost 20 years, NASA finally returned to the Red Planet in 1997 with the Mars Pathfinder mission. Pathfinder's goal was to cost-effectively deploy the first free-ranging wheeled robotic rover down on the Martian surface, with the mission carrying a suite of scientific instruments to analyze the Martian atmosphere, climate, and geology. After a 309 million-mile flight through space, the Pathfinder spacecraft arrived at Mars in July 1997. But in addition to its scientific objectives, Pathfinder was going to test a new and innovative descent and landing system.
The approach that was used to try to successfully get not just a lander but a rover onto Mars, if you'd have read about it in books 10 years earlier, you'd have said, this is crazy, this is science fiction.
If Pathfinder could successfully demonstrate this new technology, it would forever change the way scientific probes are deployed down to a planet's surface.
The spacecraft enters the Martian atmosphere at 4 miles a second. It heats up to more than 1,000 degrees centigrade, but slows the spacecraft down enough so parachutes can be deployed. Mars's atmosphere has got such a low density that even with these huge supersonic parachutes, it's still moving faster than a car speeding down a highway. So the final stage for landing, the lander and the rover were cocooned within a huge assembly of airbags. When Pathfinder impacted with Mars, the first thing it did was bounce. In Mars's much lower gravity, those bounces continued. There were more than 15 in total. And then finally, when the spacecraft came to a standstill, it only had a matter of hours of battery power for it to deflate its airbags, turn it the right way up. If any chain in that link had failed, then this mission would have been consigned to the scrap heap. And we need to remember that when it comes down to Mars, less than half of the missions at that time that had been dispatched to the Red Planet had resulted in success. And so a tremendous amount in terms of new technology hinged on the success of Pathfinder.
Now down on the Martian surface, the Pathfinder lander opened, releasing the rover to begin its scientific investigation.
Mars Pathfinder was the first rover exploration of the Martian surface. The Pathfinder lander itself landed in a place called Ares Valley, which is in the northern plains of Mars. And then a small rover rolled off and explored the local rocks and soils around the landing site. The data returned by the Pathfinder mission has started to really unlock our understanding of Mars's geological past. The chemistry that it measured of different rocks revealed insights to Mars's past volcanic history, and actually provided us with new insights that Mars had a diverse range of volcanoes in the past, right through from eruptive lavas like we see on Earth in places like Hawaii and Iceland, but also, far more excitingly, that it had a more evolved form of magmatism, possibly related to more explosive types of volcanic structures, and this was really unexpected for the Martian surface. Pathfinder wasn't designed to go and test if there were bugs or bacteria, or indeed if there's anything that existed on Mars in the past or at the present time. It was a geological exploration mission. However, the Pathfinder mission did suggest that Mars may have had a wetter, warmer past, and where there's water, there's always a possibility for life. So no bugs detected. However, it provided that key evidence that Mars may have been wetter and warmer, and may potentially have supported life early on in its history.
Collecting over 8 million measurements, 16,500 images, and outliving its design life by 12 times, Pathfinder's unprecedented data yield significantly reshaped many long-held scientific theories about the Red Planet. But perhaps Pathfinder's greatest contribution is how it has paved the way for NASA's continuing exploration of Mars.
Pathfinder led to Spirit and Opportunity in the new century. 2004 they landed. More than 10 years Opportunity was moving across the surface, visiting different sites, traveling more than 25 kilometers across the surface. A mission that was designed to last for 3 months has lasted more than 10 years. And that has been followed by an extraordinary new level of capability with the 1-ton Curiosity lander that, lowered on a sky crane, is the new way we will be sending big landers and rovers to Mars. In 2020, a copy of that vehicle with different instruments will gather up samples and leave them at a location that a future lander will visit for returning to Earth. And that itself will be precursor to the first human footprints on the Red Planet, which could easily come in the 2030s.
What we really need with Mars is to take a geologist there, because the rover can see what it can see, but it can't make decisions in real time. A human, a geologist on Mars, will be able to do exactly that. If you take, for example, the Apollo 17 mission, where Harrison Smith was a geologist and went to the moon, what he was able to do much better than a robotic system can do was to be able to say, actually, we don't want those rocks there. There's a rock that we should be investigating. There's a rock that we should take back. There's a sample we should take back, to be able to make real human decisions in real time.
But the missing link that made our modern rovers possible was the Pathfinder mission. What a tremendous legacy to have. What NASA achieved in that magical summer of 1997, deploying for the first time a Martian rover, really paved the way for the successors and the future explorations that the agency is currently planning for the Red Planet.
The exploration rovers deployed on the surface of Mars continue to rewrite the scientific textbooks on our understanding of the Red Planet. But it is clear that what NASA started in 1997 with the Pathfinder mission will ultimately culminate in an international human expedition to set foot on Mars. During the early 1970s, it became increasingly apparent to NASA and the larger scientific community that much more needed to be known about the four outer planets that dominate our solar system: Jupiter, Saturn, Uranus, and Neptune. If more could be understood about these gas giants, it could unlock secrets to the history and formation of our Earth and the solar system.
Exploring the solar system in which we live enables us to understand more about how our own Earth was formed. We are intrinsically part of that solar system. So therefore, we need to understand more about the planets that surround us. We need to understand more about how we fit in to this incredible part of the universe.
To understand our position in the evolution of the solar system, let alone the galaxy, we needed to get out there beyond the asteroid belt and really get to grips with what those planets were about. That was Voyager.
As originally conceived, the Voyager program was a sequence of missions that would see a fleet of spacecraft exploring our outer solar system. But due to budgetary concerns, the program was downsized to the two spacecraft mission of Voyager 1 and Voyager 2. However, this plan to explore the deepest, darkest, and most inhospitable regions of our solar system would need to take advantage of a favorable alignment of the four outer planets that would not occur again until the 22nd century.
The Voyager program, the Voyager missions, were only possible because of an incredibly fortuitous coincidence that our ability to design and build spacecraft and launch spacecraft coincided with an alignment of the planets that would not occur again for another 176 years, that would allow the spacecraft to fly by planets and use the gravitational energy of the flyby to increase the velocity of the spacecraft and change the trajectory, change the direction in which the spacecraft was moving in order to encounter another planet. So it was almost like a game of planetary billiards.
This favorable planetary alignment would occur in the late 1970s and allow NASA to harness gravitational assistance to slingshot the two Voyager probes from one planet to the next. Exploiting gravity in this way not only reduced the need to carry large quantities of fuel, but also had a huge impact on the mission timeline.
Without the gravitational flybys that this alignment made possible, it would have taken 30 years for the Voyagers to reach Neptune instead of 12 years, which was ultimately possible.
Although coordinated and designed by NASA, the Voyager program was a highly collaborative venture, with many scientific institutes and university research teams across the US providing scientific instrumentation. Launched a few weeks apart in the summer of 1977, the twin probes of Voyager 1 and Voyager 2 set sail for their one-way tour through our solar system. After 18 months, the Voyager spacecraft arrive at Jupiter in 1979.
The Voyager program really transformed our view of the solar system, and at Jupiter, Voyager showed us the first ever active volcanism at a place other than the Earth, with Jupiter's innermost moon Io. And there were some interesting features observed in the imagery taken during that encounter. Those features were analyzed and they were found to be the signature of an enormous volcanic plume rising from the surface of this extremely turbulent moon of Jupiter. It was really one of the landmark discoveries. The dynamics of the famous Great Red Spot, this enormous storm that has a size equivalent to that of the Earth, was studied in great detail. The Saturn encounter was arguably the most photogenic of the Voyager program. Voyager provided an immense amount of detail on the ring system of the planet. And one of the most famous discoveries that Voyager made at Saturn was the existence of what are known as shepherd moons. In the outer ring system of Saturn, there are two very small moons which were moving on either side of these rings, and these became known as the shepherd moons because the gravitational influence of those moons actually shepherds those particles into a stable orbit and makes the existence of these rings possible.
After the encounters at Saturn in 1980 and 81, the two Voyager probes part company to follow two very different trajectories, and Voyager 1 diverts to investigate Saturn's largest moon.
Titan is a very interesting moon. It's a very enigmatic moon. It was known from ground-based observations that this largest moon of Saturn had an atmosphere which was very rich in methane, and methane is of great interest in terms of the ability of a moon or a planet to sustain life. But a consequence of that was that the trajectory would take the Voyager 1 spacecraft out of the plane in which the planets move, and therefore Voyager 1 would not be able to encounter Uranus and Neptune.
However, Voyager 2 continues on its mission towards Uranus and Neptune.
In contrast to the magnificent ring system that had been observed at Saturn and the incredible atmospheric dynamics that we saw at Jupiter, Uranus itself, the planet, was actually rather featureless. The real star of the Uranus encounter was that the planet has quite a significant magnetic field. And the structure of this magnetic field is very unusual. It has a corkscrew shape, something that isn't seen in any of the other planets. And this is one of the most important discoveries of Voyager in terms of the planet itself.
Voyager 2 has its final planetary encounter with Neptune in 1989, the outermost of the gas giants and the most distant planet in our solar system.
Neptune came as a complete surprise. The atmosphere was found to be very dynamic. It had this glorious blue color which had been hinted at in telescopic observations from the Earth. What really wasn't expected was the amount of activity in the atmosphere, the existence of a dark blue storm very similar to the Great Red Spot of Jupiter, the existence of auroral features on Neptune, the existence of nitrogen geysers on Neptune's largest moon, Triton, which has a surface that is the coldest surface anywhere in the solar system. So after the rather mixed results from Uranus, the observations of Neptune were a complete surprise.
But Voyager's farewell to the planets wasn't the end of their mission. On their trajectories, it was only a matter of time before both Voyager spacecraft would leave the solar system. And in August 2012, 35 years after it was launched, Voyager 1 became the first space probe to pass into the region between the stars, known as interstellar space.
Voyagers 1 and 2 are now leaving the solar system. They're the two man-made things that are the furthest away from Earth of anything that we've ever made. They're literally going through the boundaries of the solar system into interstellar space, which doesn't sound like a big thing when you're used to Star Trek or Star Wars or whatever, but to actually leave the sphere of influence of the sun, leave the place we live in that way, is actually a fantastic achievement. And it's the beginnings of us exploring the rest of the universe. That to me is iconic. It's a major step.
It's impossible to overstate the significance of the Voyager mission. Voyager really put our solar system in perspective. But I think one of Voyager's major contributions was the way that it allowed us to put our own planet, the Earth, in some form of context. Because it's not until you observe the objects around you and you see how different they are to our own planet that we really begin to understand the formation and the significance of the place that we call home.
But perhaps Voyager's most significant and long-lasting contribution to our sense of who we are is the family portrait photograph, looking back at our solar system and our family of planets.
In amongst this photographic data is one frame with a tiny little blue dot, which is partly obscured by a light little sunbeam coming through the camera. And that blue dot is the Earth. And it's where everything that you know is, every body, everything that has taken place in history is in that little blue dot. And I think that will probably be one of Voyager's lasting legacies.
The Voyager program has given us a deeper understanding of our place within and what exists beyond our solar system. And in the 40 years since its launch in 1977, it continues to explore and enrich our understanding of our place among the stars. Named after the great American astronomer, the Hubble Space Telescope is one of the largest and most versatile scientific instruments ever put into space. Originally conceived by NASA in the late 1960s, Hubble was built to answer one of the biggest questions in astronomy.
The Hubble Space Telescope is a unique instrument. It had some particular science goals, and one of the major ones was to learn more about how far away distant galaxies are, and as a result of that, work out more accurately how old the universe was.
By placing the telescope into Earth orbit, Hubble could overcome many of the limitations of ground astronomy and peer deeper into the universe than ever before.
The telescope was built because of this need to try to get instruments outside the Earth's atmosphere to improve our view of the universe. It's very difficult to do observations that are very precise from the ground because the atmosphere gets in the way. Movement in the atmosphere makes images less sharp than they would be if you could view things from space. So being up above the atmosphere gives you this absolutely unrestricted view, but also the atmosphere blocks some of the important radiation that astronomers like to use, such as ultraviolet light and infrared light. So Hubble gives us access to a much broader spectrum of light than we can see from the surface of the Earth.
Beginning in 1978, NASA led an international collaboration with the European Space Agency to design and construct the most sophisticated space telescope ever built. Complete with 400,000 components and 26,000 miles of wiring, Hubble was carried into orbit by a space shuttle in 1990.
close and lock your visors, and you all have a good trip.
Roger that.
We are go for main engine start. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Liftoff of the Space Shuttle Discovery with the Hubble Space Telescope, our window on the universe.
Roll program.
Roger, roll, Discovery.
The telescope was deployed at an altitude of 380 miles, the Space Shuttle's highest orbit to that date.
You got to go for HST deploy ops.
That's outstanding. Thank you. First glimpse, the Space Telescope looks like it's in great shape.
Roger that, thank you.
Now outside the distortion of Earth's atmosphere, Hubble will unlock secrets to the universe no one could have imagined.
Hubble has rewritten the astronomical textbooks in so many ways. We've all seen the spectacular images that have been sent back. We've seen areas where stars are being created. The Pillars of Creation image in the Eagle Nebula. We've seen what happens at the end of stars' life when we look at the supernova remnants, and we've seen wonderful images of entire galaxies, you know, island universes, collections of billions of stars. And you ask 100 different astronomers and you get 100 different favourite Hubble images.
The Hubble Space Telescope has been incredibly successful. It was designed for 7 years of life, and here we are more than 3 times past its design life. It has a very large mirror, so it's a very large collecting area on the telescope, and that's how it's able to see so far into the depths of the universe.
The Hubble has a range of different kinds of camera on board that are designed to record the images that we all come to know and love. But they also have instruments that record spectra. That is, they split the light up into its various components, and that allows you to probe deep into objects and determine things like temperature and pressure of the gas around them.
Hubble is the only space telescope designed to be serviced by astronauts while in orbit. Between 1993 and 2009, 5 space shuttle missions repaired and upgraded the telescope to keep it equipped with cutting-edge technology.
Because of the shuttle's ability to go up to Hubble and fix it, but also take up new technology, it's been possible to convert Hubble into a 1970s designed spacecraft and telescope into a 1990s 2000 designed spacecraft. So one very good example of that is that there is a small patch of sky where, when Hubble was launched, there wasn't a single star visible. 7 years later, they took up a new camera to Hubble, and they looked again at that area of space to see if they could find any stars.
Known as the Hubble Deep Field, the image that was captured is perhaps the most significant of Hubble's career.
The Hubble Deep Field is a very, very long exposure. And the Deep Field was the first attempt to look as far out into the distant reaches of the universe as it's possible to go.
Hubble was tasked with looking at what seemed to be a blank field of sky. It was in the constellation of Fornax, and in terms of size, this was a size of sky smaller than a 1mm by 1mm square drawn on your thumb and held out at arm's length. What Hubble did on more than 800 orbits is look at that same patch of sky again and again and again, catching more and more photons, and it was an exposure time of nearly 1 million seconds. What emerges are 10,000 dots.
But those objects weren't stars, they were all galaxies. And a typical galaxy has 200 billion stars.
For me, this is the most mind-blowing image that's ever been taken in astronomy.
The impact of the deep field is particularly remarkable because you can see all these faint smudges of light that are galaxies that were being born before our own solar system and galaxy ever existed.
Using that image and using high school science and maths, you can make a meaningful estimate of the number of stars in the universe, and Hubble has shown us that what we read about in textbooks is absolutely true. There are more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on every beach on planet Earth. And so Hubble's insights have been scientific, but they've also been cultural, they've been human.
The Hubble telescope is responsible for capturing some of the most detailed deep space images ever taken, with many observations leading to breakthroughs in astrophysics.
It's hard to quantify the contribution that Hubble has made. In particular, it's helped us learn about the age of the universe. We didn't know that very precisely before Hubble was launched, and now we can say the universe is about 14 billion years old, give or take a little bit. And that's a major advance, but it hasn't just given us information on that. We can now study planets orbiting other stars and even examine their atmospheres using the instrumentation that's on board Hubble. We never even knew that these planets existed when Hubble was launched.
You realise two things. First of all, how vast the universe is, and how many stars, and therefore potentially how many planets, and therefore what the chances of life are evolving somewhere out there. And the second thing is that you realise how small a part of the universe we are. We assume we contain all the knowledge in the universe on this planet, and maybe we do. But the chances of something else evolving out there are so much greater now. We know just how many stars there are. Now, when Hubble is replaced by the James Webb Space Telescope, that spacecraft, that telescope, is 1,000 times more powerful than Hubble. So imagine what we're going to see in 2018, 2019 from that new spacecraft.
I would challenge you to find anybody who is not blown away by the sheer beauty that we see in the Hubble images. It's what taps into what it is to be human. We have this innate desire to understand our universe. And although there are other space telescopes, Hubble, for me, has set the gold standard.
The biggest contribution of Hubble, I think, has been to inspire and light up the public imagination as to what lies out there, how exciting it is, how wonderful astronomy is, how beautiful the universe is, how extraordinary, humbling it is to sit and look at pictures from light years away of objects and structures light years across. And in a world that's struck with its own deeply incisive and divisive concerns and difficulties, lifting our spirits to the wonders of the heavens can be a greatly satisfying pastime and something to turn to that just lights up a whole new understanding about what we are as human beings.
Whether meeting manned spaceflight milestones or spearheading deep space research, we've seen how NASA is pushing our technological and intellectual boundaries. In Part 2, we'll explore how NASA sustains life in Earth orbit
The Eagle has landed.
and faces the challenges of sending humans to the Moon and beyond.